Welcome back to Connections Break Barriers. This is a special conversation series brought to you by the MBA programs at Kennesaw State University. This week, we are talking to the CEO of the Community Foundation, Frank Fernandez. You will hear about Frank's career in philanthropy, but you will also hear that he's worked in a couple of other contexts. We'll talk about leadership, how he's developed relationships. All in all, I can't wait for you to experience this conversation with one of the city's most consequential leaders. See you soon. Frank, it's good to see you. How are you?
I'm good. It's Friday, so it's a good thing.
I'm excited about this conversation. You have had a long and storied career. I want to get to that stuff in a second. But before we do, where's home? Where are you from?
I grew up in Miami. Most of my childhood, I lived outside the country in Panama for a few years, but mostly Miami. So,
That's interesting. So how would you say that the experience outside of the country has shaped some bit of your life?
well, it shapes in a lot of ways because my parents aren't from this country. My parents are from Cuba. I learned to speak English when I went to school. And so in a lot of ways, I have a very different kind of origin or kind of beginning in that I feel very American, but I'm also a little bit other, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I think a lot of folks who are either immigrants or the children of immigrants kind of get that. But it definitely has shaped kind of how I view the world, how I view the U.S., and it's an interesting thing. You're in this kind of liminal space where you're kind of have a foot in one and deep foot in this one.
What did you want to be growing up? If you look at your childhood, what was the dream?
Oh man! So growing up, when I was younger, I wanted to be an NFL player. I started playing park pointer football when I was 6 years old. I played into college. That was my first thing, NFL. And then when I was in college, I decided I wanted to be a kindergarten teacher.
Wow, where did that come from? Wow.
I always liked working with kids, and then in college I did. When I stopped playing football, I started doing, helping run this nonprofit group that worked with kids. I actually taught kids dance, and so I became the executive director of like a performing arts kind of public service dance company.
Wow.
So I love working with kids. So I was like, I want to be a kindergarten teacher. And then when I graduated, I became an investment banker instead.
Wow. Okay, so talk. Where did that job come from? Right, like where did you?
It's interesting how these things. I've never been, even though professionally in my job I try to be very methodical about stuff. My personal life, I haven't really. Some people say they have like a 3-year plan and a 5-year plan. I've never had that. I ended up in that job because I had gotten an internship the summer before my senior year in college, this thing called SEO, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, and it would place Hispanic and Black students in jobs in investment banking consulting in New York, and now it's grown, it does a lot more. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to be in New York City because my girlfriend, who then became my wife, she lived in New York and I wanted to be in New York. That was the,
Did you like the job?
The job was a great learning experience, right? I worked for several years, 100 hours a week, and you were there past midnight every night on the weekends, and it's a grind. So that part did not like, but it did teach me a lot of really important skills, which I use to this day. I think in financial metaphors still because of that job. And it also taught me what I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
Right. I think sometimes it's more important to learn what you don't want than the other because it helps start. Because a lot of times it's like there isn't necessarily one thing that is going to make you happy, but you got to start narrowing the band to what are those several things that make you happy.
When you were in that job, from a relationship standpoint, like what sort of relationships were you building? I mean, imagine over 100 hours a week, you've got to be talking to somebody about something. So, what?
It's interesting because it's, you have the kind of the public and private, right? Your work life and that kind of stuff, and then your private life. And at that time, I was spending most of my time at work. And I did forge some really good friendships with the folks I worked with and other folks who lived there who did the same thing. One of them was one of my, basically one of my best friends from high school, college roommate, and then we basically did the same thing but at different firms. And those those relationships, especially when you graduate college and you're trying to figure out who you are and what you're doing. And I'm experiencing that now with my son who just graduated college. And it made me remember that like that year or two after college, you're kind of just like, okay, what is my life? You have this whole thing in front of you, and those relationships with other people who are in similar boat is really important in helping you just kind of navigate it and kind of figure it out. But again, then as I think about the relationships I had with some of the folks who were older, at least in that job, there were a couple nice people, but again, I got a really good, this sounds terrible, but example of what I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
In all honesty, in terms of
just like what you wanted life to be like. It sounds like it was like an education, and like I see what this is, and I like.
Yeah, I don't want to be him. I don't want to be him either, or him or her, but mostly hims.
What did you start to imagine at that point? Like, how were you thinking that life could be different?
For me, it was really wanting to figure out, because I didn't have a clear, some people say, okay, I want to be this, right? And then, as I just shared, football player, kindergarten teacher, investment banker, I didn't have a good sense of what I wanted to do. And, what struck me as I was doing that role is like, I want to do something that gives back differently, than this, because it doesn't feel like I'm giving back to the world or to my community. And so I just started, as I was there, I just started thinking about like, well, what are ways to do that, right? And for me, it ended up being after 3 years going back to graduate school, and in graduate school, really honing in on what I wanted to do.
So for folks that haven't had that experience, grad school experience, you went for what degree? But like I guess like your coursework was mostly what? Like how did you start to piece together what the next thing would be after grad school, or did you figure it out once you graduated?
So when I was in graduate school, I moved to Austin from New York, and I went to LBJ school at UT Austin, and it was a master's in public affairs. And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. Maybe I want to be in the public sector, maybe the social sector. So, my coursework helped me kind of solidify some of the things I was interested in, right? For me, I studied philosophy in college, and I was always interested in the intersection between philosophy and moral and political philosophy and ethics and public policy. And so being able to explore that deeper in graduate school was helpful. So my internships really helped connect me to the right folks. So kind of speaking of relationships, my first job out of grad school was a function of a relationship I developed with who the person ended up becoming my boss, and now is one of my best friends while I was an intern, because my boss at my internship was really good friends with her. Wow. Right, so those connections, right? Yeah. And she ran a new nonprofit that she had started a few years back. That was a CDFI, a Certified Development Financial Institution, and which is basically a nonprofit bank that helps provide loans to Black and Hispanic business owners in lower-income areas. And so for me, it was a nice kind of marriage of my grounding in finance and in that world with wanting to give back. So it was a good way to start that transition.
To double click on that relationship, right? Because there are a lot of folks that I think will relate to the idea of being in school at any level, right? High school, college, grad school, whatever. Yeah. And you're meeting people, right? And in theory, the way that it's talked about is that those relationships will be meaningful. But what would you say that your now friend, but then I guess student, peer, saw in you? Like, what was it about you? Because like, it's one thing to be friends with someone, and it's another thing to say, I'm going to invest time and then eventually want to work or be supportive of this person. What was it about you that you thought that your friends were identifying?
So I think for Margot, and she, actually I hadn't thought about this in years, but Ray, who was my boss in my internship after my first year of graduate school, asked her to be my mentor, right? Because she had also gone to my graduate school, so she had a connection. She's like, oh yeah, happy to do it. And so I just got to know her personally, and then she got a sense of my background in terms of having a background in finance, and that's very helpful to bring to that world, because in the nonprofit world, even when you focus on finance, a lot of folks come to it because they have a heart, but not necessarily the background, the technical background in it.
Yeah.
And so I think she saw, first we developed a relationship as a mentor-mentee, and we got along. And then she's like, oh, and I told her I might be interested in that when I graduated. And fast forward a year later, there was actually a role available. And so it kind of worked out. And just maintaining that relationship with her and just staying in touch. And the thing I tell people a lot is that, I told my kids this, some industries you have a pipeline and there's a whole track about how you work your way through it, right?
Yeah.
Whether like investment banking, there's a whole track. Being a lawyer, there's a whole track. Being a consultant, there's a whole track, and they go to schools and all that. But a lot of other roles, whether it's entrepreneurship or really the nonprofit sector, there is no track.
Yeah.
You got to figure it out. You have to be proactive, got to be entrepreneurial. You got to go develop these relationships because these things end up translating into connections or opportunities down the road. And so it's in a lot of ways, for me, it set me down that path of just trying to be much more entrepreneurial and really getting that bug.
When you think about maintaining relationships, and I know this feels foundational, right? But I am convinced that we're living in a time where some of the foundational concepts, I just don't know if they're being studied or taught in the same way. So when you say maintain a relationship, just at a really fundamental level, what are you doing? What does maintaining a relationship actually look like on the ground?
I think it sounds pretty straightforward because it's true whether professional or personal. It's just about connection and time and investing your time in being with someone and investing in them. So it's, to me, it's always very clear when someone is trying to engage with you for a particular self-serving end versus someone who has an authentic interest in you. And it's not that doesn't mean there may not be a leverage point in a positive way from a professional perspective, but there has to be a grounding and some authenticity in terms of the relationship and in terms of having some sense of care, right? I think professional and definitely personal, but professional as well. In my experience, if you take a transactional approach to relationships, then they're always going to be superficial, and if you need something or you're asking someone, they're not going to. Either they won't do it or they won't go very far to help you.
Yeah. Okay, I want to transition a little bit and talk about Atlanta.
Okay.
You've done a lot of work here across in a number of different contexts. So let's talk about the city. What was your first time that you moved to Atlanta? How did you get to the city?
So I moved here in January 2014. And I think I'd been at a conference here once for 2-3 days. And that was the extent of my knowledge of Atlanta. So I did not know Atlanta much. I moved here for a job. I had been recruited by this headhunter to go be a vice president at the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation. And they were looking for someone to come manage all their community investments and some stuff as part of the new stadium Arthur was building. So I had to manage the development of the strategy, how we're going to do our investments, and then kind of a lot of the politics around it at the community level and how it connects to the stadium.
Yeah.
And for that, it was a headhunter. I had no connection, and it kind of just unfolded.
Getting the job itself, it's hard. Getting opportunities, and again, one of the things that I really am trying to emphasize throughout these conversations is that we can go on LinkedIn and we're able to see a person's the stops that people have had along the way.
Yeah.
But there always, it seems to me, very interesting stories on how the jobs are actually secured. So headhunter calls you, to use this example. You've done a couple of different things already. Why was that opportunity the right one at that time?
So what made it interesting to me is that really ever since I graduated from LBJ, my professional focus and interests have been on issues of equity, and that's kind of been my professional North Star. And so for the first 15 years or so, I was focused on working from the nonprofit perspective, right, and sit in that seat, right. I helped run CDFI. I ran a homeless housing and social service organization for a long time. But it was all focused on those same issues, right? How can we help ensure that everyone that I have an impact on can have a fair shot at a good life.
Yeah.
For me, that's been a core tenet of my professional journey, right? And what was interesting about the role is that it focused on a lot of the same things, doing community development work with community and engaging in it, but in a very different seat, right? In philanthropy, and this is when I transitioned to philanthropy, you're working the same issues, but you're not the actual practitioner, you're the funder. And I had always worked, I'll joke, I used to have to write like 80 grants a year, every year for a decade plus. And I would say about like the foundations, like they don't know what they're talking about. They think it costs X when it costs 3X. And they think it should be easy, and it's not. And then I'll say, in my opinion, hasn't changed very much about philanthropy, because I still think we are, as a sector, we don't listen enough to both community as well as the nonprofit practitioners on the ground in terms of what they need and how they need it. So I was hoping I could do a better job. So those things really were appealing to me. And as someone who played football his whole life, I coached my son in football, in Pop Warner football. I love sports. I believe in the power of sports. I love football. And so the fact that I was connected to a football team, that was a nice, cool angle as well.
Hey, we're going to get back to this conversation, but if you're like me, you're always trying to advance your skill set and grow both personally and professionally. One of the most effective ways to do this is through advanced degrees. I'm proud to be working with my friends at Kennesaw State University for this podcast. With 3 MBA programs to choose from, executive, evening, or web, their curriculum incorporates the latest industry trends and skills that will allow you to make an immediate impact in your career. With KSU's MBA programs, you'll benefit from a flexible format that fits your schedule, including part-time options, 100% online courses, and even a unique weekend format for the executive MBA. Graduate in as little as 19 months while building lasting connections with a cohort of peers and professionals. Plus, you can see ROI fast with tuition starting as low as $20,000. Nationally ranked and featuring dual accreditation by AACSB International, ranking it in the top 2% of business schools worldwide, Kennesaw State University will help you reach your full potential. Ready to start your journey? Learn more today at ksumba.com. Take a quick step back. You mentioned that your professional North Star has been equity. Where does that come from? It's folks are interested in different things, but equity is a very strong, personal in many ways North Star to have. What's that rooted in?
For me, it's rooted in 3 things, right? The first one is I mentioned I studied philosophy, right? Yeah. I focus on political and social philosophy, and that the concept of equity and justice are foundational in political philosophy, and how do you bring that to life, and what does that look like? What are the barriers to it? And so for me, there was always a intellectual interest. That's one piece of it. A second piece is just a religious one. I grew up Catholic, and I'm a big believer in Micah 6, right? What does God require of you? But to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. And that's been a foundational thing for me from a faith perspective. And then a third is just a lived experience. When I went to college, our household income was $19,000 for a family of 5. So my family lost their home. Had electricity cut off, didn't have a phone for a year. So from a lived experience perspective, I feel very lucky that I'm here, and not everyone has had the luck I've had. And so how do you minimize the role that luck plays in someone's life circumstances and life outcomes?
That's powerful. Okay, fast forward. Let's talk about your current role. You are leading an organization that I know a little bit about, but share more about what the Community Foundation is doing on a regular basis. What's happening there?
So we are focused on how do we help transform Metro Atlanta, right? How to make it a better place for all, not just some, right? And for us, we have put equity and shared prosperity at the center of that, and really what can we do to help ensure that everyone has that fair shot at a decent and good life. So for us, it's really about, because we think that is one of the central challenges in our region, is how we address that. And then we're focused on, well, what is our unique contribution to that? Yeah. And really for us, it's about how can we go very targeted in some instances, in particular neighborhoods and communities in Metro Atlanta, and help change the trajectory of what is possible for individuals and families in those communities. And we can't do that everywhere, but where can we do that? And picking a few communities like Thomasville Heights in South Atlanta, or Fair Oaks and Cobb, or College Park. And then also looking at some of the systems, right? Because inequities and racial inequities in particular don't happen on accident, right?
Absolutely.
And so what can we do to make systems more equitable? What can we do to make systems more robust, bring more resources to certain areas? And what can we do to make them more effective and strategic, right? And for us, we're really focused on affordable housing, which is a huge area for us, the arts, we know, I've been in multiple meetings this week around how dire the situation is for so many arts groups, especially Black arts groups that historically have not gotten funded in any kind of meaningful and appropriate way by the Community Foundation historically, as well as broader philanthropy. And so how do we change that dynamic, right? Income and wealth, economic mobility is the issue in this country, and it is an issue here. And we have the lowest economic mobility rates in the country right now. And democracy, which we were just chatting about before we started, and the importance of ensuring that we live in a free and open society, and that everyone has equitable access to voting, and that everyone gets to engage in our process. Those are the things we're focused on, as well as working with our 700 plus donors to help bring to life the things they care about, in addition to those priorities I laid out.
From a relationship standpoint, you've worked on a lot of big projects, right? So maybe we can use one of them as an example. It seems like in order to get anything done, right? So it's identifying what the problems are, but then it's building a coalition of people to actually get those things done. So talk to me about that process. What do you do to mobilize people towards the vision? You have it, it's established. How do you get there?
It's I had a similar question yesterday, and I think it boils down to leadership matters, right? And paraphrasing this Margaret Mead quote that, a small group of people can change the world. In fact, it's the only way any changes happen. And I really do believe that. It starts with a group of people aligning around a shared vision for what is needed and what the challenges are and what is possible and how do we address it, right? So for me, the best most recent example is myself alongside a core group of other folks came together in late 2017 to say, look, there is growing political attention on this issue of affordable housing. And we haven't seen this before in this community, in this city. We need to take advantage of this moment to galvanize the very fragmented community to start building that coalition and building a shared understanding and a shared vision for what is possible, what is needed. And in fact, the fun thing about that story is that the first meeting of that coalition, House ATL, was at the Gathering Spot in January of 2018.
It's very humble. Wow.
And you all hosted meetings for us for 9 months, every month at the Gathering Spot, to culminating in that we had a plan in September of 2018, and we rolled it out at City Hall, and the mayor kind of took it, and she moved on the first recommendation, which was to establish a chief housing officer at the city of Atlanta, who was Terry Lee, who's now the CEO of the Atlanta Housing, and doing a great job, and I was on a panel with her yesterday.
Wow.
And she was one of the core members of helping to create that. And so to me, those relationships that we built to develop that matter. And also, one of the things I'll say is that people underestimate, one of the other things that happened during that timeline is that a group of us went to Seattle, a larger group, about 25 of us, to go do a site visit best practices. And that the technical side of it was really important, but just as important, if not more so, I would argue, was that these were a group of people who had not spent a lot of time together because it was a mix of people. It was nonprofits, for-profits, it was government, philanthropy, private sector, all moving together and going and checking out these different things and starting to build deeper relationships. And that's important because, one, you start to develop the relationship of how you get stuff done, but also when tough things come up. Because the good thing about the group is it is not a monolithic group in any sense, racially, gender, sector, or politically. And we ended up having, you fast forward like 2 years, we ended up having a hard conversation. This is actually even before George Floyd, around whether we should be talking about addressing racial disparities. We have one of the more conservative members say, I don't know if I can do that. It would be hard to get that, to sell that to my conservative friends. And we were able to have a back and forth about why he needed to be able to do that and push himself on it. And people giving him the grace because they knew him, he was committed to this issue. Yeah. And that would not have happened if we hadn't been in relationship with each other, because I think if there wasn't a relation, people back into their own corners and it could go. Yeah. And that's why relationships matter, I think, because that's the stuff that can derail an effort, a movement, an initiative.
For folks that are new to the city, right, you've covered a lot of ground in a decade, being in this town, a little over a decade.
Yeah.
How did you do it? So I know some function of this is that you were in roles that required you to meet a lot of people in order to get things done. But there could be people that would have these same roles that wouldn't have been able to accomplish all that you've accomplished, certainly from a relationship standpoint. So, like, practically, what have you been doing? Because you know many of the major stakeholders across industry in this town in what is still a short period of time.
I think the main thing, so here's what I remember when I first moved here, right? When I was in Austin, I'd been kind of active there professionally for 15 years. And over that 15-year period, I built up a lot of social capital with lots of different groups and stakeholders, right? And I earned it step by step by step. When I got here, I immediately had a lot more social capital than I had before, because I worked for Arthur Blank. And with that came all kinds of social capital. One thing I knew, which is great, it's a great starting point because you have that social capital in addition to all the resources that he has at his disposal. But one thing I knew was that if I don't take the time to build personal relationships with the folks I worked with, if I stop working for Arthur, people just will go away, or they won't want to work with me, they won't believe me, they won't hey, this is a crazy idea, what do you think? So I had to build credibility. They opened lots of doors, but then I was very intentional about trying to build credibility and relationship with all the different folks I worked with, as someone who they would want to work with, someone who was responsive, has integrity, all those things, so that if you do move, it doesn't go away, right? And for me, even in this current role, some of the social capital is a function of the position, right? But also, hopefully, over time, as I've been working at it, is I have relationships with multiple folks that transcend your role.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's key. I mean, having the title is one thing, right? But folks don't work with the title, right? They have to work with somebody. Yep. And there has to be something that hopefully you're able to spark. Frank, I've been asking everybody this question. I call it the phone screen test. When your phone rings and you see a name show up, you have a feeling about whoever's name you see come up. What do you hope people feel like when they see your name come up on their phone or over email?
That's a good question. I like that. It's interesting. Where my mind goes isn't necessarily I want them to feel this. My mind goes, I don't want them to feel this. I don't want them to feel dread or oh shit, what is he asking? What is he asking me? Or what does he want? Yeah. I think I just want them to be curious. Why is he calling? Yeah. And hopefully that they want to respond or they want to pick up.
No, it's again foundational, right? But everyone has that person that has, when the name comes up, you're like, yeah, I just would prefer this wasn't happening right now.
That's right.
But if you could be in any other part of that, I think there's a long spectrum. It's to your benefit to be. But I think that's consistency that helps to, get you to not be on the do not answer list.
Yeah. Agreed.
Part of your role now, you have to engage some of the city's most powerful, most well networked. Right, so just focus specifically on that audience, right? What do you do to maintain connection and relationship with people that are busy, have high profile jobs, all the things, right? All the things that make access to them difficult, and where they already have a lot of different requests, and you're part of the long line in many cases of people that are trying to build with them. What do you do to make sure that you're top of the pile?
I think there's a few different things you do, right? For some of them, really make an intention trying to get together, like over lunch or coffee. I think it's important to do that. The face-to-face is really, really important. Like some of that really can't do via Zoom. I think Zoom is can be about help with maintenance, but to build, you really need to be person to person. The other thing is that being in the same spaces or events, whether it's like downtown Rotary, which I'm a terrible member, I don't go enough, but things like that where you're engaging with people in places that they want to be, or they're choosing to be. Maybe they don't want to be there, but they're choosing to be.
Yeah.
And so it's not an added thing. It's like they had to go to that anyways, and you engage with them, whether a 5-10 minute conversation. I think is really important to keep that. And then also just being thoughtful and intentional about when you're in relationship with folks that it's not a one-way street. Because some of this is about, a lot of times I need a favor, or like, hey, what do you think of this? Or can you help me connect to this person, or what have you? But always being willing and responsive and returning that favor in terms of how you engage with folks, especially those who you have deeper relationships with.
My last couple of questions, going back to Atlanta for a second. What are you most excited about when you think about the city, and what is giving you the most concern?
What excites me most is that we are a vibrant, growing city. We have a lot of positive. We, in a lot of ways, I think, can serve as a model in different ways, especially for the South, right? In terms of, we have segregation, we have racism, we have all the things that we know exist here and there are other places. So it isn't like we're perfect, but we also have models that you don't see in other places. From the Black community and in the growing multiracial, multi-ethnic place that is this region especially. I was in Austin last weekend for Austin St. Louis Music Festival, and I lived there 15 years, and it's a great, amazing city. It's going gangbusters and growing. But it's a pretty segregated city. In a way that I don't see here. Even, I know we have our segregation, but other places are a lot worse. And here you do have a lot of connections between communities, whether racially or business and other, in a way that I haven't seen in other places, which I think is a great thing to build off of. In terms of the things that keep me up at night, it's why I work on issues of equity or inequity, is that we, despite all that, right, like these conflicting truths of being the Black Mecca, but also having the lowest economic mobility rates in the country. That's that's a tough thing. They're both true. And like one we like, the other one not so much. We got to fix the not so much one. That's the thing to me that we have to figure out how to better address.
And I think it's fair to say that like the only way that we're going to get there, wherever there is through relationship. It's going to be people sitting down and working through these problems, right? And I'm optimistic that of any place that I've had the benefit of spending some time in, that this city can figure it out, right? We have the best opportunity to leverage all of the talent that's here and who's interested, right? Like it's one thing to have talent. It's another thing to have talent that is interested in trying to figure it out. I feel like we're interested.
And I think it's the thing to me that is really important, because we're in the middle of this backlash against anything DIV or equity focus right now, and we got to be able to weather that. But one thing that I've become convinced on, this sometimes gets me in trouble, is that like what I see and I experience is the further you go left or right, one, people don't engage in relationships, and the more it's not like you're actually going full circle and they become mirror images of each other. And a lot of what that is an unwillingness to be in relationship with anyone that doesn't think just like they do. And that to me is like, it's the height of hubris to think you have a vice-like grip on the truth, and it's very counterproductive at the end of the day, because you're not going to browbeat someone into believing what you believe. You got to be able to engage with people, even if you don't agree with them.
My last question, and this is one that I'm asking every successful person that I know, because in your role, you're constantly talking about not only your professional journey, but also issues of the city. I have a belief that there are people that have been a part of that journey that, for whatever reason, just don't always get the airtime that they deserve, right? And so my last question, can you talk to me about a person in your life that has been extremely influential, that is certainly a part of the story, that you wish that you had more time to talk about the influence that they've had on you?
There's a few people I can think of. One person from just a professional perspective, and I haven't talked to him in a while, but he was very helpful, informative in terms of my thinking. This guy by the name of John Powell. I don't know if you've heard John Powell. Mm-hmm. He was the legal director for the NAACP. He was a Harvard law professor, and he now runs the Haas Institute for Belonging. And he has focused his entire career, I think at this point 40 to 50-year career, on these issues of justice, of belonging, of equity and racial equity, and done so in a way that I think sets the model for how I've wanted to be. Right? He has, if you've ever been engaged with them, whether one-on-one or he does lots of talks and lectures. He has this calming influence, which I think is so needed and necessary to engage on hard issues. Yeah. And a way of bringing folks together so it doesn't pit folks against one another, even though he's saying some really hard things. Mm-hmm. The only other person I've seen do that well is Brian Stevenson. He does the same kind of thing. So that's one person I'd like, for me, I think is someone I said like a mentor. On a personal level, my father passed away last year, and one of the things that three jobs ago, when I went to go take over this organization that provided housing for folks struggling with homelessness and social services, its main focus when I got there was on serving homeless veterans. And for me, the big part of why I took the job is my father was a veteran. He suffered from a lot of the things that he served 2 years in Vietnam. He fought in the Cuban Revolution, so he had a lot of trauma, a lot of PTSD. Yeah. But for family, he would have been homeless himself at a lot of points. And so to me, that also was some of the grounding, the lived experience grounding for what I do and why I do it.
I appreciate you sharing with us, and I'm sorry about his passing, but he obviously raised an amazing man. And I really, the thing that's blowing my mind about these conversations, I really appreciate the time that everyone is spending. I know how busy folks are, and to take some time to talk about relationships, and I think that the impact that it will have on someone who is thinking about picking up the phone, or thinking about a transition in their career, or thinking about how do you leverage all of the great people that may be already around them right now. It's these gentle but simple reminders of one, you can do it, and two, you need to do it, that make all the difference in the world. So I appreciate you taking some time to talk with me.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Talk to you soon.
All right.